Hey everybody, Gareth here, FCP Hero. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be doing rear brakes on an F82 BMW M4. So this DIY is going to apply to F80 M3s, F82, F83 M4s, and the F87 M2 without the carbon ceramic brake option. Also for the M2 that has the performance brake option, the slightly larger rotors, this is going to be essentially the exact same job. What we have here are OE semi-floating rotors along with Hawk performance ceramic pads and all the replacement hardware we're going to need to do the job. With that said, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need to do it, and then we'll go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so some of the tools you need for this job: you want a 17mm socket for taking the lug bolts off, a 5 and 6mm Allen for removing the set screws on the brake rotors. They're different sizes depending on the front and rear axle. 18mm socket or E16 socket, or both, depending on whether you already have the updated bolts installed or if you still have the original bolts installed and are updating to the new bolts. You want an 18mm and an E16. Of course, you want a ratchet. It's really handy to have a set of pliers for pulling out the locking pins. You might maybe need a flathead screwdriver for prying. You'll definitely want a thin punch like this in order to push the pins back through for the anti-rattle clip, and a hammer to do that with. A torque wrench you can get 110 Nm of torque out of. Of course, if you have power tools, this will make it a lot easier. I would say 2 requirements. You will need a caliper depressor of this style to push in the pistons all at the same time. If you push one side in without the other side, it's just going to move the pistons out and vice versa. So you need to push them both in at the same time. Having the tool like that to do it going to be a requirement if you decide to do brakes on your own on a car with these types of calipers. And then, of course, some kind of hook like this to hold the brake caliper up in place while you're servicing other parts of the brake system. So that said, these are the tools you're going to need. Let's go ahead and get right into it. All right, we're going to go ahead and do the rear brakes. Very much the same as the front, although unfortunately you can't turn the wheels to work with you, so a little bit more claustrophobic. But we're going to start off by removing the wheels. Again, 17mm lug bolts. So the rear wheel hubs on these F chassis M cars, so F80, F82, F83, F87. Very strange hub design. Unfortunately, this collects a lot of moisture, so if you're going to have a problem moving the wheel, it's probably going to be on the rear just because of the amount of open space that exists. I mean, you can actually see that water is straight up dropping out of this right now. So we'll go ahead and install a lug bolt because I imagine this rotor might be a little bit of a pain to remove. These set screws on the rear are 6mm Allens instead of 5. We're going to go ahead and knock the pins out of the caliper for the brake pads. Now I find that these rear pins are a little bit trickier to remove just because the rattle clip is a lot smaller, so it tends to put a little bit more pressure on the pads themselves. So all I'm doing is basically grabbing onto the pin with the pliers and sort of pulling it out. Once one pin is out, the other one will come out easy. Just there's a lot of tension on these pads from that clip. There it goes flying. The retaining clip doesn't have those locking ears like the front does, so once you pull one pin out most of the way, it might go flying like that just did there. Just make sure your head's not in this area when that happens. Now we'll go ahead and just pull our pads out. Now this side has the pad wear sensor on it. So we're going to have to basically trace our pad wear sensor wire all the way back over here to this junction block. I'm just going to go ahead and pull the pad wear sensor out of the brake pad for now, and we'll deal with that after the fact. We have the same mounting hardware for the brake caliper here on the rear knuckles. Brake's never been done, so it is 18mm bolts. They're going to be replaced by E16s, which are the new style. And just like the front, we're going to go ahead and hook the caliper. I'm going to go ahead and put it on this upper control arm there. So it's up out of the way. We'll go ahead and push the pistons in and everything like that in a little bit. Now we're going to go ahead and remove our brake rotor. Similar to the front, the rotor is stuck to the hub. Go ahead and take this ball peen hammer, hit here, right here on the face of the rotor hat, and it should come loose. Once the sound changes, it's loose. And there is the very unconventional wheel hub. You can see it just collects stuff and it gets pretty crusty and nasty. So if you're gonna ever have an issue, it's always gonna be on the rear on this car. Before we get too far, we're gonna go ahead and replace the pad wear sensor while we're here. It just hooks onto this bracket. Always make sure that you're pulling on the brake pad wear sensor, not the wheel speed sensor, which also shares the same bracket. We're gonna come all the way back here onto the subframe. You have this little housing here, which holds onto the wire. We need to open that up so we can get the pad wear sensor out. Just push back like so, and then you'll have this little lock here you want to push back on, and then you can fold the clip down. My recommendation is always to trace it back to what it connects into. We have one more little connector housing over here. We have another little connector or wiring hook here. We'll just open it like so. Disconnect the pad wear sensor, keep pulling it back. I always like to pull it back to where it connects on the body of the car. Like so. And now in here we have our little electrical connector housing. And we're gonna go ahead and open it up. Like so. And there's our pad wear sensor connector. Go ahead and pull it out, disconnect it. Next, we're gonna go ahead and install the pad wear sensor. So push it into place, you'll hear it click closed. And you can visually confirm by seeing that the little locking tab is over the lock. And then we're gonna push our sealing grommet back into place, make sure that the connector is seated properly, and then we'll go ahead and close the door. Now we're gonna go ahead and route the wire kind of in the same direction it came out. So we're gonna make sure that it is properly seated back into its little housing where it was before. Now when you close those wiring lead holders, you'll hear them click into place. And we're gonna go ahead and keep following the routing that we originally removed everything with. Need to get the wiring lead hooked into this holder here. And again, when we close it, you should hear a click. That means it's locked. I heard a little click when it went in, so we're good there. And now the pad wear sensor will be routed along this control arm here into the holder as it was before. And on this end, we just go ahead and push them into place. If you've routed everything correctly, if you routed it all correctly, you'll have this little rubber section here butted up against that, and there's a little rubber holder in the back that should be butted up against the back side of it. That means that everything is spaced out correctly and it's oriented right. So now that that's in place, we can go ahead and reinstall our brake rotor, put our pads back in, and finish up the job. We'll go ahead and take some Scotch-Brite and clean up the mating surface of the wheel hub where the brake rotor sits. The brake rotor only sits on a very small area, so I want to make sure that that's knocked back flat. All of this scale and corrosion that sits in this back area, there's really nothing I could do with that. I would really need a descaler to get all of that out. It doesn't actually negatively impact anything. It just looks really unsightly. It's a very strange hub design on these cars. Not really sure what the engineering reason was, but. Now the rear rotor doesn't have any pins on the hub, so you want to make sure that you orient this correctly. You see the two set screws next to the lug holes here. So when we put the rotor on, we want to make sure that those set screw holes line up, like so. Also, rear rotor, just like the front, is directional. You want to make sure that the drill marks are tilted towards the rear, and you want to make sure that the venting is tilted towards the rear. We're going to reinstall our set screws again. These are 6mm Allens. I put a little dab of anti-seize on the threads. We're reusing them. Again, there's nothing wrong with these, so no sense in replacing them. You can replace them if you choose, but just holds the rotor in place. Outside of that, it doesn't really do much. They're ideal for installation of brake components. Past that, they don't do anything. So if you want to replace them, that's up to you. Obviously, if they're stripped out, you will need to replace them if you want to retain that ability to put the rotor on the hub and not have it fall off, but it's not a mandatory thing. So we're going to reinstall the brake caliper. These updated bolts, they're E16 instead of 18 millimeter, just like the front. We're going to torque these carrier bolts to 110 Newton meters. We're going to go ahead and push our pistons back. The rears are going to be super easy compared to the fronts. If you've pushed the pistons back, the pad should just slide right in. And I'm also just putting the lightest coating on the very leading edge of the pad. This is what sits in the caliper. You don't need to go crazy. In fact, you could technically install them dry if you wanted to. I'm just putting a very thin coating here so we don't have the steel backing plate rubbing directly on the aluminum caliper. Like I said, pistons, when they're pushed in, the pad should slide right in. If you find that you're forcing the pad in, that means the pistons have not been pushed all the way in yet. All right, so I want to make sure that our pin is going through the pad first. Kind of already have the top hooked. With this shape in the rear here, it's a little bit finicky. Doesn't really quite hook on. Rather just sort of sits underneath. So, got to work it through like so. And then you want to make sure that the pin is lining up here on the outside of the caliper, that the piloted portion goes through. And once it does, you go ahead and finish tapping the rest of the way in. Right here. Now we're just going to go ahead and push our pad rest sensor into place. And then we'll just make sure that the wiring lead is hooked onto the bleeder like so. And you're done. All right, so that's how you go about replacing the brake rotors and brake pads on an F82 M4. Like we said in the beginning, this could be the same for an F80 M3 or an F87 M2. Really any vehicle without the M carbon ceramic brake option. Although technically, if it did have M carbon ceramic brakes, it's still very much the same process, just a lot more expensive, unfortunately. But overall, very simple to do, something you could definitely do at home by yourself. All you need is a handful of tools. I'd say the biggest thing you'd want to have is the proper caliper depressor, just to make sure that those pistons are pressed in correctly. But of course, we have an FCP Euro just in case you're looking for it. Other than that, obviously, before you drive the car, make sure that you pump the brakes to make sure that the pedal is firm. Worst thing you can do is throw it in drive or throw it in gear, start driving down the street and realize you don't have a brake pedal, so make sure that you pump the brake pedal. Also, make sure you break in the brake pads. You want to go ahead and bed those in. Do a couple of stops from 30 miles an hour to almost 0. Go ahead and build that up. You want to put some heat into the brakes. Hawk has a very specific set of instructions on how to do that, but that break-in procedure is going to depend on the brake pad manufacturer, but generally just want to put some heat in them, get some transfer between the pads and the rotors, and once the pedal feels good, you're pretty much good to go from that point forward. So I hope you learned a lot in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. Hit that like button if you like this video and hit subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way. As always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.